No benefits, no claims. She's a fake vet. The words sliced through the mahogany-paneled courtroom like a blade, each syllable dripping with 15 years of accumulated contempt. My brother David stood there, his face flushed with righteous indignation, pointing at me like I was some common criminal. What he didn't notice was my lawyer discreetly sliding an unopened envelope to Judge Williams, whose face immediately drained of all color. The judge's hands trembled as he read whatever was inside, his eyes darting between the document and my face with something that looked like recognition? Fear? "Officers, seal this court immediately!" His command rang out with such authority that even the bailiffs jumped. What happened next would shatter everything my family thought they knew about me and expose the truth I'd been protecting for over a decade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all began, back when we were just the perfect American family from Maple Grove, Minnesota. Mom used to call us her two precious gifts. David, the golden boy with his MBA and corner office at the insurance firm, and me, Jennifer, the quiet one who always seemed to fade into the background. Growing up in our colonial-style house with its white picket fence and perfectly manicured lawn, we looked like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Mom would host these elaborate Sunday dinners, the dining room table groaning under the weight of her famous pot roast and homemade apple pie. David would regale everyone with stories from his latest business conquests while I sat there, nodding and smiling, playing my role as the supportive little sister. The thing is, perfect families don't really exist. They're just regular families that get really good at keeping their cracks hidden. And our first crack appeared the day I turned 18 and announced I was enlisting. I still remember the way Mom's face crumpled, like I'd just told her I was dying. "David?" He laughed. Actually laughed. "The military? Jen, you can barely handle confrontation at the grocery store. What makes you think you can handle basic training?" But I'd made up my mind. While David was preparing for his freshman year at Northwestern, I was shipping out to Fort Leonard Wood for military police training. Those early years were hard in ways I couldn't have imagined. Not just the physical demands, though God knows those were brutal enough, but the emotional distance it created between me and my family. I'd call home every week, and the conversations always felt stilted, artificial. Mom would ask if I was still playing soldier, as if my service was some elaborate game I'd eventually tire of. David was worse. He'd make these passive-aggressive comments about how I was wasting my potential and hiding from real responsibility. But I pushed through because I had to. Something inside me knew this was my path, even if I couldn't articulate why at the time. The distance became even more pronounced after my first deployment. I came home for Christmas leave, and it was like I was a stranger in my own house. Mom had redecorated my bedroom, turning it into her craft room. "Well, honey, you're never here anyway," she explained with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. David barely looked up from his phone during dinner. When I tried to share some of the lighter moments from overseas, nothing classified, just funny stories about camp life, he'd roll his eyes and change the subject to his latest promotion or the new car he was buying. That's when the real toxicity started seeping in. David began making these subtle digs about my choices, my career, my entire life. "Must be nice not having any real bills to worry about," he'd say when I'd visit. "Living off the government, traveling the world on taxpayer money." Mom would laugh nervously and try to change the subject, but the damage was always done. I started visiting less. The phone calls became shorter. I told myself it was just the nature of military life, the distance, the secrecy, the way civilian life starts to feel foreign after a while. But deep down, I knew the truth. My family was slowly writing me out of their story. The law office where it all came to a head was everything you'd expect from a prestigious estate attorney. Leather-bound books lining the walls, oil paintings of stern-faced judges from decades past, and that particular smell of old money and older secrets. Mom had been gone for 3 weeks, and we were finally gathering to hear the reading of her will. I'd flown in from my current assignment, still in my dress uniform because I'd come straight from the funeral home where we'd handled the final arrangements. David was already there when I arrived, perfectly pressed in his $1,000 suit, chatting easily with the attorney like they were old golf buddies. "There she is," he said as I walked in, but there was something different in his tone, something sharper than usual. The mysterious sister, gracing us with her presence. I ignored the comment and took my seat across from him at the polished conference table. Mr. Peterson, Mom's lawyer, cleared his throat and began the formal proceedings. Most of it was standard: charitable donations, personal effects, that sort of thing. But when he got to the major assets, David's entire demeanor changed. To my daughter Jennifer, I leave the house on Maple Grove, along with my investment portfolio and the majority of my liquid assets totaling approximately $2.3 million. The words hung in the air like smoke. David's face went through a series of colors: confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. What about me? What about her son who actually stayed, who actually visited, who actually gave a damn? Mr. Peterson consulted his papers nervously. "There is a provision for you, Mr. Mitchell. Your mother has left you her car and $50,000 with a note stating that she trusts you've built your own successful life and no longer need her financial support." That's when David lost it completely. He started pacing around the room, his voice getting louder and more accusatory with each sentence. "This is insane. She barely even knew Jennifer anymore. When's the last time you even had a real conversation with Mom, Jen? When's the last time you came home for more than a weekend?" I tried to stay calm, to de-escalate like I'd been trained, but David was just getting started. "You know what I think? I think you manipulated her. I think you played the whole poor little soldier act to guilt her into this." The accusations kept coming, each one more vicious than the last. He started questioning everything about my service, my character, my relationship with Mom during her final years. "You were never even really in combat, were you? What do you actually do over there? File paperwork? Push pencils around?" I sat there taking it, the way I'd learned to take his verbal abuse over the years. But something was building inside me, something that had been dormant for too long. When he finally paused to catch his breath, I spoke for the first time since entering the room. "David, I understand you're upset, but Mom made her choices for her own reasons." My voice was steady, professional, military-bearing, they call it. "Perhaps if we could discuss this like adults," but he cut me off with a harsh laugh. "Adults? You want to talk about being an adult? Adults don't run away from their families for 20 years. Adults don't hide behind some uniform and pretend they're heroes." The word heroes dripped with such contempt that everyone in the room flinched. Mr. Peterson looked increasingly uncomfortable, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. But David wasn't done. He'd found his target, and now he was going for the kill shot. "You know what really bothers me, Jen? It's not even the money. It's the lie, the whole elaborate fiction you've built around your so-called service." He made air quotes around the word, his lips curled in disgust. "Show me one photo of you in actual combat. Show me one commendation that means anything. Hell, show me one story that isn't obviously sanitized PR nonsense." The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should take a break." But David held up a hand. "No, I think it's time we all faced the truth here. Jennifer has been playing dress-up soldier for 2 decades, collecting a paycheck for doing God knows what, and now she's cashed in on Mom's misguided sympathy." He turned to face me directly, his eyes blazing with years of accumulated resentment. "What exactly is your military occupational specialty, sister dear? What do you actually do when you're deployed? Because I've done some research and your name doesn't show up anywhere in public records. No unit citations, no promotion announcements, nothing." I felt something cold settle in my chest. He'd been investigating me, digging into my service record, or at least trying to. The fact that he'd found nothing should have been his first clue that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than he understood. But David had never been one to let facts get in the way of a good narrative. "So, here's what I think happened," he continued, building momentum like a prosecutor delivering his closing argument. I think you've been living off the taxpayers for 20 years, doing some cushy desk job while pretending to be some kind of warrior. And Mom, bless her heart, bought into your whole act. The poison was spreading now, each word more toxic than the last. David had found his rhythm, and he was going to ride it all the way to the end. He started pacing again, gesturing wildly as he laid out his theory. Think about it. When's the last time anyone actually verified her claims? When's the last time we met any of her military friends? When's the last time she showed us a single piece of documentation that proved she was anything more than a glorified security guard? I could have stopped him, could have pulled out my phone and made a single call that would have ended this charade in minutes. But something held me back. Maybe it was training. Never reveal more than necessary. Maybe it was family loyalty. Even toxic family deserves some protection from the truth. Or maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see how far he'd go, how deep his contempt for me really ran. You want to know what I think, Jen? David's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. I think you're a fraud. I think you've been lying to this family for 20 years, and Mom died without ever knowing who you really are. He straightened his tie, a gesture so characteristic of his corporate persona that it would have been funny under different circumstances. But that's going to change today, because I'm going to contest this will, and when I do, everything about your precious military career is going to come out in court. That's when I made the call, not to the number most people would expect, not to a commanding officer or a Pentagon desk jockey. I called my lawyer, Sarah Chen, and told her we needed to go to court. David heard enough of the conversation to misinterpret it completely. Oh, so now you're going to fight this legally? Perfect. I can't wait to see you try to defend your imaginary service record in front of a real judge. He was practically gleeful at the prospect. This is going to be beautiful, Jen. Absolutely beautiful. 3 weeks later, we were sitting in that mahogany-paneled courtroom, facing Judge Williams. David had come prepared with his legal team and what he thought was ironclad evidence of my deception. File folders full of public records searches, Freedom of Information Act requests that had come back empty, and testimony from family friends about my suspicious behavior over the years. He'd built an entire case around the absence of evidence, never once considering that maybe, just maybe, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The will reading itself was a formality. Mom's wishes were clear and legally sound. But David had filed his contest, and now we had to address his claims in open court. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Richards, laid out their case with theatrical precision. Your Honor, we believe the deceased was systematically deceived about the nature of Ms. Mitchell's military service, and that this deception directly influenced her testamentary decisions. I sat there listening as they painted me as everything from a simple malingerer to an elaborate con artist. David took the stand himself, his voice full of righteous indignation as he detailed my pattern of deception over the years. She would disappear for months at a time, Your Honor, claiming to be deployed to classified locations. But when she'd return, she could never provide specific details about her service. No photos, no stories, no fellow servicemen who could corroborate her claims. When it was my turn to respond, I stood slowly and approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit some documentation for your review. So, Sarah handed me the envelope, the same envelope David would later notice her passing to the judge. It was unmarked, sealed with red wax, and stamped with classifications that most people have never seen outside of movies. Judge Williams broke the seal carefully, his experienced eyes scanning the first page. I watched his expression change from professional curiosity to shocked recognition to something approaching awe. He looked up at me, then back at the document, then at me again. Ms. Mitchell, I need to verify the authenticity of these documents. This court is going into recess while I make some calls. But David, riding high on his own self-righteousness and completely misreading the judge's reaction, chose that moment to make his final, fatal statement. He stood up from his seat at the defendant's table, pointed directly at me, and in a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the entire courtroom, declared, "No benefits, no claims. She's a fake vet." The words echoed off the wooden walls and stone floors. Every person in that courtroom, the bailiffs, the court reporter, the few family members who'd come to witness this spectacle, heard him clearly. But what David didn't see, what he was too caught up in his own performance to notice, was Judge Williams' face going pale as death as he continued reading my file. The judge's hands were shaking now as he reached the third page of the document. His lips moved silently as he read, and I could see him processing information that most federal judges never encounter in their entire careers. Classification levels that exist in rumors and whispers. Mission designations that don't appear in any public database. Unit identifications that are literally state secrets. When Judge Williams looked up again, his entire demeanor had transformed. The casual authority of a small-town judge was gone, replaced by something I'd only seen a few times in my career. The reaction of someone who suddenly realizes they're in the presence of something far beyond their normal experience. His voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Officers, seal! This court immediately!" The bailiffs moved with military precision, their boots echoing against the marble floor as they secured every entrance to the courtroom. David's confident smirk faltered as he watched the heavy oak doors swing shut with an ominous finality. The casual observers who'd wandered in hoping for some small-town drama suddenly found themselves trapped in something far more serious than they'd bargained for. Judge Williams set the classified documents aside with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, his weathered hands still trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge's voice carried an authority I'd rarely heard outside of military command structures. "What you are about to witness is protected under the National Security Act of 1947. Any discussion of these proceedings outside this courtroom constitutes a federal crime punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's lawyer, Richards, was frantically shuffling through his notes, clearly realizing that his carefully prepared case had just become irrelevant. Judge Williams turned his attention to me, and for the first time in 15 years, someone in my family was looking at me with something approaching respect. "Ms. Mitchell, or should I say, Major Mitchell, would you please approach the bench?" The title hit the courtroom like a physical blow. David's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and the first flickering signs of genuine fear. Major, not just any enlisted soldier, but a field-grade officer, someone with serious responsibility, serious training, and serious secrets. I stood and walked forward, my posture automatically shifting into the bearing that had been drilled into me through 2 decades of service. Back straight, eyes forward, every movement deliberate and controlled. Behind me, I could hear David's sharp intake of breath as he finally began to process what was happening. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and professional, "I believe my service record speaks for itself." Judge Williams nodded gravely. "Indeed it does, Major. For the record, and for the benefit of those present who may not understand the significance of what they're seeing, would you please state your current military status?" This was it. The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for 15 years. The moment when the carefully constructed wall between my two worlds would finally crumble. "Your Honor, I am Major Jennifer Mitchell, United States Army, currently assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Division. My primary military occupational specialty is 35S, Signals Collector, Dodge Analyst, with additional specialization in human intelligence operations and counterintelligence. I hold a top-secret, sensitive compartmented information security clearance with Special Access Programs authorization." Each word fell into the courtroom silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond these walls. The color drained from David's face completely. Behind him, I could see our cousin Marie pressing her hand to her mouth in shock. Even Mr. Peterson, who'd known our family for decades, was staring at me like I'd just sprouted wings. But I wasn't finished. 20 years of silence was about to end, and I was going to make sure my brother understood exactly what he'd been mocking all these years. My operational deployments have included Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several other locations that remain classified. I have served in direct support of Special Operations Forces, conducted sensitive site exploitation missions, and provided intelligence support for operations that have directly contributed to national security objectives. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. The reason my brother could not find any public record of my service is because my assignments have been classified at levels that preclude public disclosure. Judge Williams consulted the documents again, his expression growing more grave with each page. Major Mitchell, according to these records, you have been decorated with the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Bronze Star with Valor Device, and the Joint Service Commendation Medal, among others. Is that correct? David made a choking sound that was barely audible, but I heard it. 20 years of accumulated contempt was colliding head-on with a reality he'd never imagined. That is correct, Your Honor. However, due to the sensitive nature of my assignments, these decorations have not been publicly announced, nor do they appear in standard military databases accessible to civilian researchers. I turned slightly, making eye contact with David for the first time since this revelation began. My brother's inability to verify my service record was not due to any deception on my part, but rather due to legitimate national security protocols. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the ventilation system humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, the barely audible tick of the grandfather clock. David was staring at me like I was a stranger, which, in many ways, I was. The quiet little sister he'd been bullying for 2 decades had just revealed herself to be someone he'd never known existed. Richards, David's lawyer, finally found his voice. Your Honor, my client was not aware. But Judge Williams cut him off with a sharp gesture. Mr. Richards, I suggest you advise your client to withdraw his contest immediately. Challenging the mental capacity of a woman who entrusted her estate to a decorated intelligence officer is not a position you want to defend in federal court. But David, to his credit or detriment, was never one to back down from a fight, even when he was clearly outmatched. He stood up, his voice shaky but determined. This doesn't change anything. She still abandoned this family. She still chose her precious career over her own mother. The words carried less venom now, tinged with desperation rather than confidence. Military service doesn't give you the right to ignore your family for 20 years. That's when something inside me finally snapped. Not anger. I'd been trained to control anger. It was something colder, more precise. 20 years of swallowing his insults, his dismissive comments, his complete inability to understand the sacrifices I'd made not just for my country, but for his safety, for his freedom to live his comfortable little life without ever knowing about the darkness that exists in the world. You want to talk about abandonment, David? My voice remained level, but there was steel underneath it now. Let me tell you about abandonment. Abandonment is missing your nephew's first steps because you're in a bunker in Kandahar, analyzing communications intercepts that prevent terrorist attacks. Abandonment is not calling home for your birthday because operational security requires complete radio silence during a mission that could save American lives. I took a step toward him, and I saw him instinctively step back. Abandonment is coming home from deployment to find that your family has decided you're a failure because you can't talk about the work that keeps them safe at night. Abandonment is sitting at Christmas dinner, listening to your brother mock your career while you're carrying classified knowledge about threats that would give him nightmares if he knew they existed. David's confident posture was crumbling. We didn't know, but I wasn't finished. 20 years of silence had built up a reservoir of words that needed to be spoken. You didn't know because you never asked. You never once considered that maybe, just maybe, there was more to my story than you understood. You were so convinced of your own superiority, so certain that your corporate success made you the golden child, that you never bothered to look deeper. Judge Williams was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a long overdue reckoning. Major Mitchell, in your professional assessment, did your family's lack of understanding about your service affect your relationship with the deceased? It was a carefully worded question, designed to let me articulate something that had been eating at me for years. Your Honor, my mother understood more than she let on. 3 years ago, she received a visit from someone in my chain of command. Due to security protocols, I cannot discuss the details, but she was briefed on the general nature of my work and the importance of maintaining operational security. This was news to David, and I watched his face as the implications sank in. She knew why I couldn't discuss my deployments. She knew why there were gaps in my communication. She knew why I sometimes had to leave family gatherings abruptly. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Mom had known. She'd understood why I couldn't explain, why I couldn't share, why I had to maintain distance, and she'd never told him, never corrected his assumptions or defended me during his rants about my supposed failures. She'd let him believe his version of events while secretly knowing the truth. So, when my mother made her testamentary decisions, I continued, she did so with full knowledge of my actual service record and the sacrifices it required. Her decision to leave me the majority of her estate wasn't based on deception or manipulation. It was based on understanding, respect, and perhaps a desire to ensure that the child who'd given everything for others would finally be taken care of. David sank into his chair, the fight completely gone out of him. The man who'd walked into this courtroom confident in his righteousness, certain of his superior claim to family loyalty, had been reduced to a hollow shell of confusion and regret. "Jen, God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." His voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the sealed courtroom, everyone heard him clearly. But apologies were cheap, and I'd learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. "David, do you remember what you said to me at Mom's funeral, when I had to leave early for what you called another one of my mysterious trips?" He looked up at me, his eyes red with what might have been tears or might have been shame. "You said I was selfish. You said I was using the military as an excuse to avoid real responsibility. You said Mom deserved better than a daughter who couldn't even stay for her own mother's burial." The memory hung between us like a blade. "What you didn't know was that I'd been recalled because a situation had developed that required my immediate attention. American lives were at stake. I had exactly 6 hours to report for deployment, and I spent 4 of them at Mom's graveside, saying goodbye to the woman who understood my sacrifices even when I couldn't explain them." Judge Williams cleared his throat gently. "Major Mitchell, I believe the court has heard sufficient testimony to resolve the matter at hand. Mr. Richards, does your client wish to withdraw his contest?" Richards looked at David, who nodded numbly. "Yes, Your Honor. My client withdraws all challenges to the will." But I wasn't ready for this to end. Not yet. There were things that needed to be said, truths that needed to be acknowledged, and consequences that needed to be faced. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to address my brother directly." Judge Williams nodded. "Proceed, Major." I turned to face David fully, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. Not as the golden boy, not as the successful businessman, not as the favored son. Just as a man who'd spent 20 years systematically destroying his relationship with his sister, based on assumptions he'd never bothered to verify. "David, for 20 years, you've made my life smaller. Every family gathering, every phone call, every interaction we've had has been poisoned by your contempt for choices you didn't understand. You've questioned my patriotism, my dedication, my love for this family, and my basic honesty. You've done this publicly, repeatedly, and without ever once considering that you might be wrong." He tried to speak, but I held up a hand. "I'm not finished. You stood up in this courtroom and called me a fake veteran. You accused me of fraud, of deception, of manipulating our dying mother. You did this in front of a judge, in front of lawyers, in front of family members, and in front of court officials. Your words are now part of the public record." The implications of that statement were just beginning to dawn on him. In our small town, news like this would spread quickly. By tomorrow, everyone would know that David Mitchell had publicly called his decorated war veteran sister a fraud. The man who'd built his reputation on being the responsible son, the successful businessman, the pillar of the community, had just revealed himself to be something much smaller and meaner. But here's what you still don't understand, David. Even now, even after everything you've put me through, I protected you. Every mission I completed, every threat I helped neutralize, every piece of intelligence I gathered that kept Americans safe. That included you. You've spent 20 years benefiting from my service while simultaneously mocking it." Judge Williams was nodding slowly, understanding the deeper tragedy of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a family dispute over inheritance. This was the collision of two worlds. The world of people who serve in shadows to protect others, and the world of people who live in comfort, never knowing about the sacrifices made on their behalf. "Major Mitchell," the judge said quietly, "what would you like to see happen here?" It was a question that went far beyond the legal proceeding. He was asking about justice, about healing, about what came next for a family that had been broken by 20 years of misunderstanding and cruelty. I looked at David, really looked at him, and for the first time in decades, I felt something other than hurt or anger. I felt pity. He'd spent so many years being small, being petty, being cruel to someone who'd never deserved it. He'd missed every opportunity to know his sister, to understand her sacrifices, to be proud of her service. He'd chosen ignorance over curiosity, contempt over compassion, and superiority over humility. "Your Honor, I don't want revenge. I never did. What I want is acknowledgement. I want my brother to understand that his behavior has consequences, that his words have power, and that 20 years of cruelty can't be erased with a simple apology." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I want him to understand that from this moment forward, we are no longer family, not because of the inheritance, not because of the military service, but because he has repeatedly shown me who he is, and I finally believe him. The finality of those words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. David's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy I'd once protected from neighborhood bullies. "Jen, please, I can change. I can do better. I didn't know—" But I was already shaking my head. "David, you've had 20 years to ask questions, to show curiosity, to demonstrate basic respect for choices you didn't understand. You chose mockery instead. You chose cruelty instead. You chose to diminish me instead of trying to understand me. The real tragedy here isn't that you didn't know about my service record. It's that you never cared enough to find out. You were so invested in your narrative of the successful son and the disappointing daughter that you never bothered to consider that maybe, just maybe, your narrative was wrong." I gathered my composure, straightening my uniform jacket. "A real brother would have trusted me. A real brother would have supported me even when he didn't understand my choices. A real brother would have given me the benefit of the doubt." Judge Williams cleared his throat one final time. "The court finds that the last will and testament of Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell is valid and will be executed as written. Mr. David Mitchell's contest is dismissed with prejudice." He paused, looking around the sealed courtroom. "I want to remind everyone present that the information disclosed here today is subject to national security restrictions. Any unauthorized disclosure of Major Mitchell's service details or assignment history will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law." As the bailiffs began to unseal the courtroom, I felt a strange sense of closure settling over me. Not the triumphant vindication I might have expected, but something quieter and more profound. For 20 years, I'd carried the weight of my brother's disapproval, his mockery, his complete inability to see me as anything other than a disappointment. Now, finally, the truth was out. Not just the facts about my service, but the deeper truth about who we both were. David remained in his seat as the courtroom began to empty, staring at his hands like they held answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Our cousin Marie approached me hesitantly, her eyes wide with something that might have been awe or might have been fear. "Jennifer, we had no idea. I'm so sorry for everything." I nodded, accepting her apology without fully embracing it. The family members who'd stood by while David systematically undermined me weren't innocent bystanders. They'd chosen sides through their silence, and now they were learning the cost of that choice. "Marie, I understand that this is a lot to process, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about the inheritance or the military service or even the family dynamics. This is about 20 years of cruelty that was completely unnecessary. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, David finally stood up. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfect hair mussed, his corporate confidence completely shattered. "Jen, wait, please. Can we talk? Really talk? I know I have no right to ask, but—" His voice trailed off as he saw the expression on my face. "David, we just did talk. Really talk. For the first time in 20 years, you heard the truth about who I am and what I've sacrificed. And your first instinct wasn't pride or gratitude or even basic respect. It was denial, then bargaining, then damage control." I shouldered my bag, the same military issue pack I'd carried through 3 combat zones. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." I walked toward the exit, but paused at the door. Not because I wanted to give him false hope, but because there was one last truth that needed to be spoken. "You know what the saddest part is, David? Mom saw all of this coming. She knew exactly who you were and exactly who I was. Her will wasn't just about distributing assets. It was about making sure that the child who'd given everything for others would finally be protected from the child who'd given nothing but taken everything." The heavy oak door closed behind me with a solid thud, sealing David inside with the wreckage of everything he'd thought he knew about his family, his sister, and himself. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm on my face for the first time in years. I wasn't the quiet, accommodating little sister anymore. I wasn't the disappointment who'd chosen military service over family loyalty. I was Major Jennifer Mitchell, and I was finally truly free.